Now, the Buckeye Extra podcast with Rob Oller, Bill Rabinowitz, and Joey Kaufman from the Columbus Dispatch.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Buckeye Extra football podcast. I'm Joey Kaufman, joined by Bill Rabinowitz, Rob Oller. It's Tuesday, January 28th, and we are firmly in off-season mode, covering now a defensive coordinator departure in Jim Knowles, who on Monday officially left to become the new Penn State defensive coordinator in a move that was somewhat surprising. There had been certainly some smoke around it for a couple days and rumors and speculation of whether Knowles would sign an extension or in pay raise with Ohio State or continue to be courted by other schools. And indeed, he was not at Ohio State's championship celebration, and it appears he was on his way to Central Pennsylvania to become Penn State's defensive coordinator.
Yeah, there was enough smoke going on even during the championship game that day that I saw Knowles after the game and asked him a couple questions about the game, and then said, it was actually more about Oklahoma at that point. There was a lot of talk about him going back to Oklahoma. He'd coached at Oklahoma State, and this was Oklahoma. And so I said, can you say anything about this? He said, I'm coaching at Ohio State. Now, you can parse that and say, well, of course he's coaching in the moment at Ohio State. That doesn't answer the question whether he's going to stay at Ohio State. But, in the chaos of the post-game celebration, I was going to say, well, Jim, could you clarify exactly what I'm coaching at Ohio State means? And it wasn't really the time or place to do that. But clearly, well, first of all, the most obvious answer is the money. I mean, he's getting $3.1 million a year. And Ohio State was prepared. I mean, they told us, they were ready to make him the highest paid defensive coordinator in the country, which would have been 2.75. That's what Wink Martindale and Michigan is going to make next year. Were there other factors involved? There's all kinds of speculation. I don't know that we'll ever know for sure unless Jim Knowles bears his soul someday or Ryan Day shares some more insight. But, he's been a guy who's tended to move every few years anyway. That's part of that's just the nature of the coaching business. But he's bounced around a lot.
Yeah, it's I won't say it's shocking. There's nothing shocking anymore in college football or sports really, but definitely surprising, and even all the more so because it was Penn State. He goes to Oklahoma. Okay, he's you don't see him again. He's in the SEC. Goes to Notre Dame, which also was mentioned. It's like, okay, no big deal. But he goes to Penn State, and a lateral move. Maybe even a downward move, although I think when you're going from power program to power program, it's pretty lateral. But it was surprising. I said, I've been covering college football for close to 30 years, and this was the most surprising move related to Ohio State that I've seen in terms of a coaching move. You could see if he'd have left to be a head coach somewhere or even go to the NFL, but to be a defensive coordinator at Penn State, which, is closer to his home in Philadelphia. But Joey and I were talking, we don't totally buy the, get closer to home thing. He was looking at Oklahoma and Notre Dame. They're farther from home. So, the fact that was the biggest draw, like Bill said, I don't think we'll ever totally know, but Buckeye Nation isn't real happy. I would say maybe it's split, or maybe there's probably 60-40, traitorous, they're calling him. That's a little strong, but I think that it's surprising. It doesn't it's a head scratcher for sure.
Bill and I were talking about this too on Monday. When is the last time you have seen an Ohio State offensive or defensive coordinator leave for another coordinator job? It's unprecedented in Ryan Day's tenure, and you can go back to their Remeyer days. It was pretty rare. Got coordinators who have left have been Kevin Wilson, who went to become the Tulsa head coach, or Jeff Hafley, the defensive coordinator in Day's first year, left to become the Boston College head coach. So you tend to see that type of movement. You haven't seen them really leave for a lateral job. And I think you can make the case that Penn State is not even quite a lateral move, but a downgrade in terms of the prestige of coaching at Ohio State versus Penn State. It's more money, so it's a pay bump and all that. But Ohio State's won 3 national championships this century. Penn State hasn't won a national championship since 1986. So I think Ohio State's the better program to be at generally. It's a really an unusual, rare type of move you see from a coordinator at Ohio State.
Yeah, as I've been saying, one thing you know for sure is that when you love being at a place and the money's close, you stay at the place typically. The fact that he left, sort of signals that he just wasn't loving his situation, and who knows what that was. Was he butting heads with Ryan Day? Did he feel disrespected? Was it as simple as the money offer made him feel disrespected? 2.75 versus 3.1. You kind of think there was some internal stuff going on. There's a lot of noise out there. None of it's substantiated, but I will just stand on he did not want to be at Ohio State, period.
Well, I would also not dismiss the possibility that he's the guy who kind of says, okay, mission accomplished, what's the next challenge? We won at Ohio State. He's going to have to coordinate a rebuilt defense. I mean, you certainly have some great foundational pieces. You have Caleb Downs, you have Sonny Styles, you have Davis Igbinosun, but there aren't many starters coming back. And Penn State is loaded. It's funny, Penn State is essentially trying to do what Michigan and now Ohio State has done, which is load up for a championship run. A lot of their guys, Drew Aller and some of their other studs, are coming back. And so they're gearing up for their what they hope is their run at a national title. So maybe that was a lure. I don't buy the Pennsylvania thing. I mean, I lived in Pennsylvania for 10 years. State College and Philadelphia might as well be two different worlds. First of all, they're not close to each other. It's at least a 4 or 5 hour drive. I mean, there's the old political adage that Pennsylvania is Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Alabama. The rest of it's Alabama. I mean, State College is in the Alabama portion of it. I mean, State College itself is kind of an enclave, but it's completely different than any other. It's not like it's a suburb like Downingtown where Will Howard grew up. That's close to Philadelphia. That's Philadelphia-ish. State College is not.
I will say this as far as his Pennsylvania ties. He did grow up watching Penn State games on television. That is the team where if you are a young boy growing up in Philadelphia at the time he did, where you are not, it's not like today in college football where there are 30 games on at one time. The team that you would have seen in your market was Penn State. So there probably is some nostalgia there, but in terms of just your day-to-day living, is what Bill said. It's another world, State College versus Philadelphia.
Yeah, it's easy in hindsight too that hey, the head coach has to be rah-rah, has to be Buckeye Nation, has to be OHIO. The assistants don't have to be that as much. That said, I never thought, again, hindsight now, looking back, you sort of look for clues. I never thought, not that he should be, but I never thought that Jim Knowles was the type of guy that was like Brutus Buckeye and Buckeye Nation and in the traditions. He was, he's a ball coach. He's a defensive coordinator. Bill touched on this. He's a little bit of a rolling stone in terms of he's been around, but I never really sensed that it was about like the history of the program and he was all in with it. Again, who not a lot of guys are, but I didn't sense that he had some deep love because he didn't for Ohio State. If he had any deep love, it was for Penn State, as Joey just said. He grew up with that, and he, in his talk, there was a clip on this today. He says, he grew up a Penn State fan. This is where he always wanted to go. Well, that may be true, and it's also a convenient little out to why he maybe left here without creating any controversy. What can you say when a guy leaves for his boyhood idol team? It's like, okay, I guess that's where he always wanted to be.
Yeah, we might as well just address kind of, I don't want to say it's an elephant in the room, it's something in the room. I mean, there's been a long-standing conversation about whether how well he meshed with other coaches on the staff. Larry Johnson being the kind of the one that people have talked about. I never got the sense there was any real problem. You never know what's behind closed doors. We do know this. After the Oregon game, the first Oregon game, they changed the defense. and they changed the pass rush, which worked, right? I mean, the pass rush down the stretch was really, really good. And so whatever changes were made, I mean, it wasn't like Ryan Day did what he did to Kerry Combs a few years ago and stripped him of his duties. It wasn't like that at all. But it was okay, let's kind of figure out what happened here at Autzen Stadium and fix it. And were there bruised egos from that process? Who knows? There was no way to know that stuff unless, somebody can get deep behind that. That's not happening now. So whether that was a factor, whether it was just that he wanted a different challenge, the money, maybe the respect. I mean, these guys have egos, and the fact that he's the highest paid defensive coordinator and that he was courted by Penn State, obviously, and whoever else, probably felt good. And maybe it was just, look, I'm ready for a new challenge. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm 59 years old. Let's close out my career in my home state. I accomplished what I came to Ohio State to accomplish.
I think about the changes they made after Oregon, they became more like a Jim Knowles type of defense. Right. It wasn't as if they made these changes where they stripped his defense of its identity. And in a lot of ways, it went back to his Oklahoma State roots where they were blitzing more and they got more sacks, because when he came here, that was the feature of the Oklahoma State defense, was they were second nationally in his last year there behind Alabama in total sacks. And that was a big reason why they ultimately made a title push, was they triggered something in their pass rush and in their blitz packages where they're able to get as much pressure as they were late in the season. That was a hallmark of what his defense was. Granted, they weren't quite. You think about the way his Oklahoma State defense is lined up with 3 down linemen and a 4th stand-up pass rusher. They never quite did that, and that's where people have speculated about maybe a philosophical disagreement with Larry Johnson. But in a lot of ways, they became more Knowlesian after Oregon. I think maybe a tell next year will be if Ohio State's playing Penn State on November 1st, and Penn State's lining up with 3 down linemen and a jack on the edge. Then maybe we'll get a little bit of a clue there.
I'd say that game's going to be a fun one, right? I mean, November 1st, we have the marquee home game of the year next year. I mean, well, you have Texas. I mean, you got some good ones next year. You got Texas to open the season, then you got Penn State November 1st.
We're fortunate too in a way to get the matchup, because Ohio State and Penn State are no longer not protected rivals in the Big Ten. And in 26, Penn State is off Ohio State's schedule. So this is the year where you're actually going to see these two teams play, because it's not a guarantee you're going to get them every year.
And remember, it takes time to change a defense. Knowles' first year at Ohio State, they made progress, but it wasn't what it became. And there's an adjustment period for these teams and these coaches. So Knowles eventually might have the same kind of dominant defense at Penn State that he had at Ohio State, but it won't necessarily be next year. There'll be some growing pains, because there almost always are. Now, by November, maybe they'll be, cleared up mostly.
I was thinking, you guys are talking about the did he get was his ego, bruised? And I'm not so sure it was the changes as much as the verbiage that went on with, like, Ryan Day talking about band-aiding and then, if you remember, we forget Nick Saban
antiquated.
Called out the defense for being basically antiquated.
Yeah, that was the word.
And it's not that Saban, that wouldn't cause you to leave Ohio State because Nick Saban said it, but who knows? The reaction to Ryan Day was like, well, it's true if it's true if you don't get it done. And maybe that ruffled some feathers. Listen, we don't know. I mean, this is, again, looking back, you can kind of see these little whispers of things that maybe played into this. I just truly believe it was a combination of all this stuff. Probably money leading the way, but there was enough dissatisfaction with his current situation for him to walk.
Yeah, that's obvious, because he's gone. I mean, if he were completely happy, he'd be here. Ohio State would have made him the highest paid defense coordinator. He would have said, well, I don't need $3.1 million a year. 2.75 or whatever it would be is enough. And that wasn't enough. So clearly something, because it's hard to move. I mean, the other thing, I have no idea what role this played. No idea. Maybe it played no role. But he just got engaged. And whether, where's the fiance want to live? I have no idea.
State College or Columbus, Ohio.
Well, I think she's from. I think
maybe she's an outdoorsy prepper.
I don't know.
Maybe she's a prepper.
So maybe he just kind of wanted a clean break. Again, everything is just idle speculation. We really do not know. He has not talked about that. Ohio State's side has not talked about that. I know there was disappointment that he wasn't there on Sunday. I do know that. There was definitely a disappointment that for the celebration of the national championship, he wasn't there.
Who's next?
Well,
who they fill in with?
Who's next? I mean, the internal options they have is probably you look at Matt Guerrieri to start with. He is from the Knowles coaching tree. So if you were trying to have some continuity with the system and style of defense you play, you start with him, and he has experience as a coordinator. He was the co-defensive coordinator at Indiana in 2023. He was the co-defensive coordinator at Duke from 2018 to 21. So 5 years of coordinating experience. Your safeties coach, coaches your best player, and Caleb Downs. They referred to him as one of the brighter minds in college football during the celebration on Sunday, which did not seem like an accident, the way he spoke glowingly about him in front of 30,000 people. So maybe he was tipping his hand there. I think that would make some sense. You also have Tim Walton has a background. He was a defensive coordinator in the NFL a decade ago. So maybe you look at making those two guys co-defensive coordinators. Otherwise, you start sort of from scratch. And it's interesting because Day's track record in hiring coordinators is a little bit all over the place. You look at Kerry Combs, which was a very familiar hire for Ohio State folks, where he was a name that people were comfortable with, and they went with some continuity there to try to run a single high defense that they were running earlier. And then he also went and found Jim Knowles, who was the hottest name on the market and at the end of the 21 season as a Broyles Award finalist. And they gave him a sort of a blank checkbook, and he made him one of the highest DCs in the country at the time, $1.9 million. Obviously, the market for defensive coordinators has changed dramatically in 3 years. But you've sort of seen him do different stuff where he's going to hire somebody he knows, like Jeff Hafley. His first year, they coached together in the NFL, hired somebody familiar for Ohio State in Kerry Combs, and then went out and hired somebody he didn't know in Jim Knowles, who was just I think a hot name at the time, and certainly that paid dividends for Ohio State.
I think he'll probably pick up the phone and make a few phone calls and then probably get shut down right away. I mean, Hafley would be a guy that, there's no harm in calling, right? I mean, I've seen like Phil Parker at Iowa, who's been a great defensive coordinator there. I mean, I can't imagine Phil Parker would leave after all this time. That is his name. It's Phil, right? I can't remember.
Phil Parker, yeah.
Unless they want a ring.
Yeah. Well, that may be. I mean, that's why you make the phone call. I mean, there are guys like that. We say, well, doesn't hurt to call. But realistically, look, it's Ohio State. People are going to be flooding him with their resumes. They're going to get names that are really impressive, because who wouldn't want to coach at Ohio State? I mean, Ryan Day has a good reputation for being a good boss. So obviously, you got all the resources you could imagine. There's going to be no shortage of candidates.
Here's an interesting scenario: the Chip Kelly route. Is there a head coach out there tired of being a head coach and just wants to be a DC?
Well, I got one for you. There's somebody in Madison, Wisconsin, who might be on a little thin ice.
Well, yeah. I mean, Luke Fickell, you throw that name out there. Just who is the head coach that's like, I'm done with this. I just want to coach. I mean, I think that's another option.
It ain't going to be Mike Vrabel, guys.
Well, that's off the table.
Yes, it is.
All those people that knew the realtor who was selling Mike Vrabel a house in Columbus. Sorry.
Yeah. Look, they're going to get a really good candidate. Who knows if it'll work out, but whoever the person is will be highly credentialed. Or
it wouldn't shock me if they promote from within.
If I were a betting man, I'd say the favorite is Guerrieri, just because they like him. He said glowing things about him. It is the Knowles system. Basically, that's what he's come up in. So it'd be continuity, as Joey said. So if I had to put my money on one person, that's who I'd put on. But I don't know that he's an odds-on favorite.
How much do you think continuity in the system matters this year? Because they are rebuilding on that side of the ball.
Yeah, that's a good question.
8 out of your 11 starters, and one of the 3 returners is Caleb Downs, who probably could pick up a new scheme quickly. So do you look at that as a situation, hey, we're rebuilding on that side of the ball, we can introduce a new system, or the fact that you have a lot of inexperienced guys, maybe you don't want to add to the learning curve at all with a younger roster?
I've got a novel idea. We've heard it's been a long time since we had player managers, right? How about Caleb Downs, player/defensive coordinator? I tell you what,
I'm not sure it would be the worst move in the world. Honestly,
I bet you, Caleb Downs more than any player that we've ever known could do it. It's obviously, just joking, obviously, but I wouldn't be surprised if Ryan Day consulted with Caleb Downs about this. Not to make it, but to say, what do you want? What works? I wouldn't be shocked if he sought Caleb Downs' input in this.
Well, first of all, that's smart because, when you lose your coordinator, who knows? The transfer portal's closed, right? And a coordinator leaving doesn't open it back up for you. It's only the head coach, right? But still, you don't want a disgruntled player. So, yeah, he'd be smart to just get their input, how much that factors in. But I just find the whole thing, it's very intriguing who they're gonna name. I think Joey made a good point. It's a new defense, so maybe you don't have to keep the Jim Knowles system. What's Larry Johnson think? Does Larry Johnson want to be the D coordinator? He's been passed over, and this is interesting too. Let's remember, Jim Knowles goes from Ohio State to Penn State for whatever reason, not totally happy. Larry Johnson left Penn State for Ohio State in part because he didn't get really considered for, I believe it was a head coach job.
Yeah.
So so that was, they had to be a little stunned in Penn State when Larry Johnson left. What amazes me is how much D coordinators and O coordinators have risen in celebrity through the years. This is a relatively recent phenomenon of these guys getting paid all that money and also sort of being these kind of 1A to the head coach. It just wasn't the case. Woody Hayes ran the show. Barry Switzer, John Robinson, you can go down the line. These guys ran the show, and now it's these guys have carved out their own little camp of celebrity status and getting paid for it.
You think about 2018 was the first year Ohio State began paying coordinators $1 million. That was Ryan Day and Greg Schiano. And that was just over $1 million.
That was a big deal at the time. A big deal.
And it's seven years later, you're talking about them offering Jim Knowles a contract that was close to $3 million. That is a significant change in the market. And on top of that, they're going to have to start sharing revenue with players next year. I don't want to get into a whole financial weeds discussion, but the salaries, as Rob said, is really have skyrocketed. And even the cult of personality around some of these coordinators, I think part of that is the head coach is in a lot of ways less involved with scheme, because the head coach in this NIL transfer portal area is almost like part of the personnel office and part GM and part head coach. So your coordinators are so critical to the operation. I think that probably contributes to the salary increase and just the gravitas that they carry.
I'm just curious. What is 3 point? He's getting 3.1 reportedly. Could be 3.2, but close to a little over 3 million. What's the top Mid-American coach make? Head coach.
Oh, well, we could look it up.
It can't be
even close. Not even close.
It can't even be that, right?
No, not even close.
Maybe it should.
Think about this. Woody Hayes made five figures.
Woody made for a long time, $50,000.
Yeah, they lived in a middle class house.
He didn't feel, but that was partly him.
I know he didn't want it. He didn't want the money, right? He was an odd bird that way. He did not.
He was an odd bird. Yeah,
in a lot of ways, but it wasn't. I remember. I think it was Cooper. It was John Cooper that when he got to Ohio State was just stunned by how little they paid the assistants and had to go to the administration and say, "I'm losing guys." We're not even competitive with paying assistant coaches salaries.
Yeah.
And that started, I mean, in some ways, in many ways, John Cooper started the modern Ohio State football program. I mean, Woody Hayes was there for so long. Earl Bruce was his successor in a lot of ways, a slightly definitely a modernized version of Woody, but it was a version of Woody. It was Cooper who came in and said, wait a minute, we can't just say we're Ohio State and the rules that govern college sports don't apply to us.
To touch on the head coach responsibilities as far as everything they have to do nowadays, part GM, part head coach. I think what's different about this coordinator search than 3 years ago when they ultimately hired Knowles is if you all remember, they referred to him as the head coach of the defense, and right. Ryan Day was very much on the offensive side of the ball, still calling plays, still running quarterback meetings. And that label was I think a sign of the autonomy that you were going to get as the defensive coordinator. You're on that side of the building running the defense. I'm on this side of the building running the offense. Now Day is going to be more involved in defense, most likely the way he was after the Oregon game. And it's probably more important or as important as ever for that to be a partnership the same way it was with him and Chip on the offensive side of the ball, where there's going to be times where he's going to be very hands-on with coordinating that defensive side of the ball in a different way than it was 3-4 years ago, simply because he was stretched so thin between his job as a head coach and calling plays. The absence of having to be the primary play caller for the offense gives him a little more free reign to jump into special teams and defense. But now if you're going to have a defensive coordinator, you do need somebody who really is on the same page with the head coach. And that's less of a comment about him and Knowles having a relationship and more just about who they get next, because there are going to be situations like the Oregon game where he's going to get in those defensive meetings.
Well, the very first game they play next year is against Texas. Arch Manning takes over and they got a bunch of studs on offense and it's going to be a challenge. I mean, he's not opening with, they're not opening with Grambling. He's got Texas, so that'll be interesting. And because of Ryan Day's implicit trust in Chip Kelly, he can kind of say, okay, Chip, you got the offense. I mean, it's not going to be to that degree. Obviously, he's always going to be involved, but he trusts Chip, and so he can spend more time. But the other thing is, look, on offense, Julian Sands, we assume, or whoever, it's going to be a new quarterback. And Ryan Day is never going to relinquish his responsibilities and his interest in molding quarterbacks. That's just who he is. So he will spend a lot of time trying to get whoever the quarterback is, we presume it's Julian Sand, up to speed. And so it's not going to he's not going to have the time to just kind of coddle a new defensive quarterback. But again, you're going to get somebody who's not going to need that. You're going to either get, if it's Matt Guerreri, he knows the system, he's been here, or if it's somebody outside, it'll be somebody so established that he won't have to hold his hand.
You mentioned Chip Kelly, so let's just address that. I mean, Chip Kelly, 1 year here, I would be surprised if he left. Again, never shocked. I wonder even if he was flirting with the NFL, which, let's not forget, he flirted with the NFL before he came to Ohio State when he was UCLA's head coach. Didn't work out. Reportedly, Seattle Seahawks, that didn't work out for him. He comes to Columbus. He's close to Ryan Day. I would just wonder that even if he has some interest in the NFL, if because Jim Knowles left and you have to replace your defensive coordinator, whether Chip Kelly would feel almost an obligation to remain so that you're not having to replace both coordinators, which would put a lot of stress on Ryan Day. I don't know that friendship, how it works, but I could see that being the case. We know that Chip Kelly has some interest in the NFL. We just don't know how much and how soon he would leave.
I think the X factor with all these guys is now that they've won it, now that they've accomplished the biggest goal, do they kind of feel like, okay, next mission? Right. I do think that's a factor in Knowles' decision to leave, that the job was done. It wasn't a mission unaccomplished. It was mission accomplished. Now, I think Chip, he looked so happy last year just being the defensive coordinator, even just in the press conferences. He was so much looser than I understand he was, certainly in the NFL, where those were like almost Belichickian, or UCLA when these things weren't very good. I mean, he just wants to be a coach, and this has allowed him to do that with his, one of his best friends. I don't see him leaving anytime soon. Look, nobody's ever shocked by anything. You can't be. But if you'd have said which coordinator would leave after last season, I would have said Knowles, because I didn't expect him to leave either. Don't get me wrong, but I think Chip is very happy. I know their wives are close, and so he's 60 years old. And does he want to start somewhere else? I mean, yeah, the NFL itch is probably always there. And if the right opportunity came up, maybe he'd be tempted. But I certainly don't see him leaving for any college job. That's for sure.
No, it would be an NFL. Well, again, he wanted the Seattle, or at least showed interest in the Seattle Seahawks job last year. So, I kind of see it as Harbaugh-ish, whereas Harbaugh every year dallied with the NFL and yet ended up returning to Michigan until the right opportunity arose.
Well, most of the NFL
jobs. I don't think Chip Kelly does not want to be a head coach. No. I shouldn't say he doesn't want to be. If somebody's going to pay you to be the head coach in the NFL, sure. But I would, he still has to recruit here. I think he was just out on the recruiting trail. Who knows? He does not strike me as the type of guy that loves recruiting. I'm not planting seeds here that Chip Kelly's out the door, but I wouldn't be shocked, and I'm not even sure I would be less surprised than Bill that if he did leave. I think that friendship does factor into it, leaving Ryan Day holding the bag a little bit.
We'll see. You always got to find somewhere to go. So
most of the NFL jobs are taken at this point. I mean,
as a head coaching job, it would be a question, I guess, if you go as more of a coordinator. Where
Houston has an opening. That's all I'm saying, and they got a pretty good quarterback.
Yeah,
who's quarterback? I don't know who the quarterback is.
Google it.
Yeah, Kurt Signetti.
Before we go, let's maybe touch on some roster updates. The deadline for Ohio State's juniors to declare for the draft was last Friday. They had an extension due to the playing in the final of the college football playoff. They had three guys who had decisions to make: Quinshon Judkins, Davis Enigmenosin, and Sonny Styles. Two out of the three of those are coming back. Quinshon going pro, I don't think that was unexpected by any means when you look at the amount of carries he had in his college career. Over, I think, almost 800 carries in his logged over, I think, 200 carries each year at Mississippi. And then I think Ohio State getting Davis Enigmenosin back and getting Sonny Styles back, I think was important and probably as well as they could have hoped for at the declaration deadline in terms of getting some continuity on defense.
Yeah, I thought Sonny Styles was likely to return because it was his first year as a linebacker, and he did really come on at the end of the year. He was really good at the end of the year. But I think another year, he's the kind of guy that could just be a dominant player once he kind of just knows to react and not have to think at all, because he's got all the physical tools and he's a smart guy. He works hard, studies the game. So I could see him taking another big leap next year and then becoming a first-round pick. Enigmenosin has one major issue he's got to clean up. He's got to clean up the handsiness. The pass interference calls, he's got to clean that up. And this will be interesting. Jim Knowles was asked about that several times. He never seemed to have a problem with the way that Enigmenosin played. That's fine. That's the price we pay for the style he plays. I bet you the next defensive coordinator is going to be, wait a minute here. I mean, look, in the Notre Dame game, it was 3rd and 19, I think. And they threw basically just throw it up to Enigmenosin's guy, and Enigmenosin got a pass interference call. He doesn't get that call. Notre Dame has to punt, and it probably doesn't even become any kind of game. I mean, it gets overlooked when you win, but he's got to stop that. He's got to. I mean, he's a very skilled player. He's a very competitive player. There are lots of things to like about him as a player, but he's got to become more disciplined. He just has to become more disciplined. So I think it makes sense for him to prove it in a final year of college that he can be that guy who can be a lockdown cornerback without all the penalties. You're going to get some, but look, we've said all year, if you're facing 3rd and long, what do? You throw it to the guy, that he's covering, because there's a decent chance you'll get a flag. But he's a good player, and you certainly want him back.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Knowles told us, that he didn't have a problem with him. Right. So behind the scenes, he may have laid into him. I'll just leave it at this. I mean, they've got some pretty good foundation. Caleb Downs, Sonny Styles. They've got some decent talent there, but I'll just put it out. It's just unrealistic to think that next year's team will be this team. I mean, it just is. I mean, no one's saying it will be, but let's just put it out there that both defensively and offensively, I know you've got Jeremiah Smith back. I know you've got the decent tailback coming up, but you have an untested quarterback. I think just enjoy this season, and then next year is sort of a fun year to see what you have.
Hey, one position that's going to be upgraded, I think, that Max Clare from Purdue is a really good player, a tight end. They're going to be good at tight end next year.
G. Scott down the stretch
he was very good.
Was good enough for you.
Very good, very good. But I don't think, getting Max Clare is a coup. That's a really good get. And I think the offensive line, the way that they played in the postseason is encouraging because you got to rely on those guys. Donovan Jackson's gone. Obviously, Josh Fryer's gone. We don't know how the offensive lines are going to look. But the fact that Luke Montgomery went in there and they won with him, Austin Serval, they won with him. Tegra, who had a shaky year, let's face it, he was up and down.
You have a left tackle, Bill. Do you have a left tackle?
Yeah, I think the guy, I can't pronounce his name, the guy from Rice, I think he's your left tackle. Joey, I don't have the name in front of me.
They did add to the portal with two starting offensive
in Minnesota. Philip Daniels, is that his name? Philip Daniels? I can't remember his name. They've got pieces. And, if you'd have said 2 months ago, what's Ohio State's offensive line going to look like next year? You go, oh, my God, it's going to be awful. But now, they held up during the playoff. That's pretty impressive that they held up the way they did because I certainly thought when McLaughlin went down, that was it. That was their national championship hopes were basically done. And they proved me wrong, to their credit.
Well, we will certainly have more offseason coverage as things pick up, and especially around the search for a new defensive coordinator for whoever steps in to replace Jim Knowles. That is certainly at the top of our radar. We went very quickly from football season to off season with the coordinator search. It was, I think, we were maybe hour after the celebration.
Wasn't he with that?
Yeah,
we were asking, Ryan Day afterward, kind of pinholed him. And he said, okay, nice celebration, huh? That was cool. Now, what about your coordinator?
I think it is fair to say Ryan Day can't be real happy with Jim Knowles at this moment.
No, I'm sure he's not. And look, I asked him, do you expect him back? I expect him back. Now, he may have just been saying that because he didn't want to create news on the day that they had their celebration. That's, it's not the first time a coach has misled a reporter. I'm not faced by that at all.
Yeah, I'm sure he was expecting him back until Jim Knowles was finalizing the deal to become Penn State. Then he was probably not expecting him back.
Right.
Odd move. I'll leave it at that for me.
He's a little bit of an odd guy. I like him a lot. We would every year we would go to Starbucks or whatever and do the pre-training camp, whatever. And he was, he's a normal guy, but I think he's there's a little quirkiness to him.
It is ultimately an odd move, and certainly he has his quirkiness. I do think, with all that said, it should do. If you're an Ohio State fan, I would not get caught up in the drama of his departure. The Jim Knowles tenure was very good for Ohio State. His arrival is a big reason why they won a national championship. I think when you look back on the season and the previous years under Knowles' tenure, he rebuilt the defense from a low point. Under the Kerry Combs, Matt Barnes partnership of 21, they got much better. I think they maximized the personnel they had this year with guys like Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau in the back end with Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs. I think certainly he was instrumental in them winning a title.
You know what I'm going to say?
Now that he's coaching for Penn State and you want to critique everything and not, I would not lose.
Yeah, I would say this. Absolutely, he was critical to the national championship run. Michigan game, a little different story.
Well,
right?
not this Michigan, not the last.
Not this year, but previous years they couldn't get off the field.
I think 22, you could pin maybe the failures of that season and not getting over the hump with CJ Stroud a little bit on the time it takes for Knowles' system to take effect.
Sure.
I think
he gambled in that 22 game and they got burned.
Well, that's why it's weird that after the Oregon game, this whole system sort of changed. I don't know. Well, someday we'll know about what happened and how that all went.
Some of it this year, he had better, more experienced players.
Yeah,
who
exactly.
understood the system.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
but look, I mean, he had great players, and he was a great defensive coordinator, and that's really his legacy. His legacy is he was the defensive coordinator on a national championship team that was the number one defense in the country, and that's the legacy. That's what he did.
Yep.
I think that is all well, Frank. Thanks everybody for joining us on this edition of the Buckeye Extra Football Podcast, and we'll be back in your podcast feed as news develops throughout the offseason. Thanks for listening.
Be sure and subscribe to the Buckeye Extra podcast in the iTunes Store, the Google Play Store, or on Stitcher.